Today on the Matter of Degrees podcast, we have Frank Camp, Executive Director of Brand Strategy at the University of Arizona. Thank you so much for the time this morning, Frank. So Frank and I met at the AMA conference last year. We had awesome conversations there on the conference floor that kind of resulted in us just sort of going back and forth. And I thought the perspective from a brand strategist would be super valuable to have on the pod. And I would love to jump in. But before we do, Frank, introduce us to you, the University of Arizona, and your role a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Justin. Like Justin said, my name is Frank Kemp. I'm the executive director of brand strategy at the University of Arizona. Um, I've been at the U of A for about 13 years. Spent a lot of time in international marketing and communications, and then moved into a central role about 5 years ago at a time where we were trying to address, as many universities are, the kind of extreme decentralization of marketing and communications across our campus,
Mm.
um, and moved into a role that really aimed to bring some stability to our marketing and communications division and bring some connectivity to our marketing and communications division. Myself and my colleague Jenna Rutschman, who we were both hired into kind of similar roles to kind of consult with the campus Marcom community. And over the course of the last several years, that's evolved into the organizational structure that we have today, where I'm really leading the brand strategy efforts and really defining what our institutional strategy and institutional approach is to brand marketing. And my colleague Jenna kind of continues to be in that campus consulting role. So that's
Fighting
kind
a
of how
good
we're set
fight.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that actually brings up a good point because I think one of the things that immediately attracted me to our conversations and sort of keeping the conversation going was that element of strategy. Because a lot of times when we mention or when we talk on the show here about brands, it often gets to sort of the creative execution, the pretty pictures, the really fun videos, the really compelling emotional scripts. But talk to me a little bit about the strategy element and how that looks day to day, year over year for you guys.
Yeah, so we several years ago, I guess about 7, 8 years ago, had an institutional brand strategy that, exactly like you said, was launched the same day that the institutional brand campaign was
Of
launched. And
course.
everybody focused on the pretty pictures, everybody focused on the visual execution of that brand. And the strategy behind it kind of got lost and never really translated to how Marcom folks, I was in a campus marketing role at that time, never really translated to how we were doing our day-to-day job. Um, so when we realized it was time to revisit our brand strategy, we had had a lot of campus turnover, new president, all of those fun
Mm.
things, and it was the right time to revisit the strategy. We made a really intentional decision to do strategy first and creative execution completely separate. I mean, it was a
Smart.
separate RFP. It was a separate team of folks on that RFP, and it was a really distinct process. And we didn't even launch the creative RFP until the brand strategy was signed off on by the president. We really created a dividing line between those two, and we continue to do that in the day-to-day operations. It it reflects itself in the conversations that my colleagues and I have every day, right?
Yeah.
We all know our lane a little bit better than we
Mm.
did in the past. We all know, how we're approaching strategy exponentially better than we did in the past, um, and it creates a much more functional process,
Yeah.
much more efficient process because we're just a lot more clear on where those rules and where those dividing lines live.
That's awesome. I'm glad you said the word functional because I get the opposite in a lot of the conversations I have about how are you guys talking about brand or thinking about brand or applying brand strategy to your executions, and the dysfunctional word gets thrown in a lot, or the inefficient word gets thrown in a lot. And so, you saying the opposite of those is really cool. But I think just the intention that you guys went in it with of a dividing line and saying this is strategy, this is visual execution. And we had talked previous, but I think it would be valuable to sort of talk about how you guys went about that, and laying down that strategy. So if you could kind of give some context and tell us a little bit about that process, I think that would be really cool to hear.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the process again lends to that idea of everyone knowing their role in
Mm,
the process, right? So, uh, our approach to the brand strategy work was not novel, right? It was your typical research and development phase, ideation phase, uh, drafting,
yeah.
rounds of edits, all of that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
right? It's none of that was groundbreaking. But what we did is we were really intentional about who was in the room in each of those phases of the process. It was a really inclusive process. We had over 1,000 people involved end to end in the process. But it was clear what each person's role was in that process, right? So in the research and development phase, we had research faculty, students, deans, department heads, all the people who like to give you their opinions. And we heard all of those opinions, right? And then instead of just jumping to drafting things, we we formatted those findings in a way that was digestible by those
Yeah.
people. So we kind of set it back to them
Mm,
and kind of made them agree that that's what they said, right?
mm-hmm.
And then we got into drafting. And in the drafting process, that's where we engaged the Marcom community, right? So
Sure.
I mentioned the kind of decentralized situation we have at the U of A,
Yeah.
again, not unique to us, but we have about 400 or so people across campus who have marketing and communications roles. And we engaged almost all 400 of those people in that drafting process. So and that was in small groups, 5 or 6 people,
Yeah.
kind of larger workshopping sessions where we had 40 or 50 people,
Wow.
and then a really big kind of we do a big Marcom conference every year, and about 300 or so of those 400 folks come to that every year. And that was kind of the final draft, the round 2.5, right before we presented it to the president, was presented to those folks for feedback. And we were genuinely, legitimately taking feedback throughout that whole process and ideating on the drafts throughout that whole process. And then we went back to most of those groups from round one and presented the final-ish
Mm,
draft to all of them for another round of feedback. So again, closing that loop, which I think is something that gets missed pretty regularly.
for sure.
Like, we listened to you and then we finished it, and there you don't ever really close that loop. And I think we did a pretty good job of closing that loop with most of the people. We're still going out there, we're still road showing this.
Smart.
In fact, we're presenting it to our business schools advisory board next week. We presented it to our College of Science advisory board a couple of weeks ago. So we're still in that process, but
Sure.
I think that inclusiveness, but again, really defining what each group's role is in the process was what made this successful.
I think that's such an important element. And like you said, that sort of closed feedback loop gets missed so often because it's like, well, they were involved at the front. We took what they said, we processed it, we put words to paper on it. But that sort of last step of here's what we heard, here's it back to you. Are we still on target? And I think that was one of my favorite parts of what you had described to me of bringing back to them what we heard.
Yeah.
We talked with a previous guest about just the authenticity of a brand, and that word gets thrown out like it's going out of style at AMA and everywhere else in marketing right now. But I think to me, that's sort of the artifact of authenticity. And so the fact that you guys did that, I think is something a lot of folks can learn from, or at least, consider as they go into 2026 and beyond. Did you have any, like, you mentioned, still communicating this, still taking it to stakeholders, and that agency, how is that received? Was there any challenges in how you got there, or that's not what I said, you heard it wrong? Was there anything like that?
Very little. I
Yeah.
mean, shockingly little. It's been, a lot of my colleagues, including myself and my boss, and come from agency backgrounds, and have dealt with difficult
Yeah.
clients and difficult rooms and all of that. And I think across the board, all of us have said at one point or another that this has been the smoothest brand strategy project we've ever worked on. Um, and I think the reason for that is because we've been so deliberate about what the process is,
Hmm.
and we set some expectations early on about what we were trying to accomplish, right? And I think one of the biggest ones was, we were very clear up front that the intent of this was to go deeper, not broader.
Hmm.
I think we fall into this trap of trying to be everything to everyone in higher ed, and it's just not attainable. And it starts to break down really early in the process, right?
Yeah.
It starts to break down as soon as you're in a room with 8 deans of 8 different academic colleges, right? It breaks down right there. But when you set the stage saying we're intentionally narrowing the focus, it helps those people understand, why you might not see every mention of every academic college
Mm.
in the brand strategy. So I think that was a big thing.
Yeah.
We did run into most of the critique or feedback that we got throughout the process was really wordsmithy.
Yeah.
Um, and which again is a clear indication to me that we were doing it right.
Hmm.
If all you have issue with is the specific word that we chose, we can
Great.
choose different words.
Yeah.
Nobody really contested any of the spirit
Yeah.
of what we were trying to say,
That's
which I think,
amazing.
Justin, you said authenticity is a little bit of a cliched word at this point,
Yeah.
but I think it does stand to reason that if people from students to deans didn't take exception to the spirit of anything we said, then we are being
You're
authentic.
pretty right on. Yeah, it was, that's how we kind of frame it up, is authenticity is just the truth spoken, visualized, or felt or experienced. And so I think that going in with that intention, allowing folks to orient themselves to the objective and the intention of their role, like you had mentioned earlier, really just sets the whole process up for a better result or to be more successful than maybe what we've been trying in the past.
For
Um,
sure.
I wanted to follow up on the words, because a lot of the what you had shared with me with the brand strategy was those four brand pillars that you
Yeah.
all established. And I think about, everything to everyone. If it was up to everyone, there'd be 45 brand pillars, because we have to, account for every single thing. But I think you guys did such a good job narrowing that focus and being really intentional with those pillars. And I think that uh, deliverable, essentially, to be a sort of cornerstone of anything forward moving, is really, really powerful. And so, to our audience, I think considering something like a foundational brand document that supports pillars that you orient around, is something to consider. Could you talk a little bit about those and just how you got there, how they were formalized, and then obviously it's been working and you've been communicating them through? Um, I think that would be valuable.
Yeah, for sure. So, um, totally agree that kind of having these pillars is what makes this successful, right? It gives I've been mixing my metaphors on this, so depending on what day you catch me, I've been using a like we're planting the seed with these pillars
Nice.
and you are the ones that make the story grow. Or, I've made some bakery analogies. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways to kind of explain this. Um, but I think, first things first, and this kind of gets to what I was just saying. The thing we did early on, we all know, everyone across campus likes to think that they're a marketer, and in most cases they're right. Like they all have a marketing role, but I think it's important to kind of give that branding 101 lesson
Mm,
to anyone that you're engaging in this process. So when we got to discussing the pillars, we gave that branding 101, right? We said brand pillars are largely an internal document. You're never going to see these
yeah.
posted on a wall in Old Main. You're never going to see these on Arizona.edu's homepage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again that helps in defining the lane of what you're working on, what that deliverable is and what it isn't.
Yeah.
Um, Arguably more important, what it isn't. Uh, but so we in that research and discovery phase, we just listened, right? And the words that we heard, the themes that we heard were so remarkably consistent that it actually made it really easy to define the four pillars. Every meeting that we had talked about two things without exception.
Yeah.
One was the fact that we exist in the Sonoran Desert, and the second was the idea of bear down.
Yeah.
um, so those two were like no-brainer pillars, right?
Mm,
The other two took us a little bit more effort to kind of draw out exactly what we mean by them.
yeah.
But the pillars, just to give you an idea of what the four pillars are, the first pillar is an enduring legacy.
Mm,
So this is that idea that we've been here for 140 years. We're the most storied institution in the Southwest.
yeah.
We've been doing great things for all of those 140 years. And something that you said, Justin, that really resonates with this is it's not just about the past, it's about how it brings us toward the future.
Yeah.
So that enduring piece, that piece that we're still building this legacy every single day, is an important part of that pillar. The second pillar is shaped by the Sonoran Desert. Everybody,
Sense of place.
brand, whether it's a university or another physical location brand, talks about sense of place. I do think our conversation about sense of place is a little more distinct than most. We're number one, number two in water research in the desert. And we are that good because we're in the desert.
Yeah.
We have to be really good at water. And we're number one, number two in astronomy research, because we have these dark skies, because we have these sky islands where,
Mm,
I can look out my window and see our observatory up on Mount Bigelow and Mount Lemon. They're 9,000 feet up, and they're 30 minutes from town,
mm,
maybe 45 from campus, and you get past that city glow, and that's what allows us to be good at astronomy.
yeah.
And so that sense of place is more than just we're in a pretty place that's warm and sunny, although that's really important too. The third pillar is excellence without pretense.
I love that one.
Yeah, this is kind of my favorite, and it ties into something I'm going to share with you guys a little bit later, I think. But excellence without pretense, colloquially, I can never say that word right. Uh, we refer to that as laid back, smart people.
Yeah.
Tucson, if you've never been to Tucson, come swing by. I'm happy to give anyone a tour of our campus and show you around a little bit. But it's a pretty laid back place, and it's a laid back place that does remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
It is a comfortable place to be. We aren't a community of egos, although we have egos. We're not a place of battling those egos
Mhm.
against each other. It's a collaborative community, and that leads right into the fourth pillar, which is bear down, build up. If you're a sports fan, you've heard us say bear down, and you've probably said, well, you're Wildcats. Why do you bear
Bear
down?
down.
Bear down has a long tradition. Actually, today, you're not supposed to say today on a podcast. Today, though, we're launching our Bear Down 100 campaign.
Mhm.
So it's actually hitting the market today.
Oh, that's
Uh,
awesome. Congrats.
this is the 100th anniversary of Bear Down. And so Bear Down has been a cornerstone piece of this university for 100 years. And it's this spirit of determination and a commitment to community and a commitment to doing hard things together. So those are the four pillars. Again, they've been really well received. They really resonate with every part of campus. And again, in that kind of go deeper, not broader,
Mm,
they're pretty narrowly focused, but they tie into everything that we do because, again, because they are authentic, because they
yes.
are true to who we are as a university.
No, I love that. I think there's a few things, and I would love to get into it if you want to, share that with us. But I think we shared a story about, some of the feedback you got, and like you said, it was sort of wordsmithing, but the story about that word excellence and what
Yeah.
that started out as. Could you tell that story? Because I think that's so cool.
Yeah, I thought that was a really fun conversation. So our SVP for research is great. He's brought some fantastic momentum to our research enterprise and has been a really good partner of ours.
Yeah.
And he was really engaged throughout the brand strategy process. When we brought that when we closed that loop with him, he said we that pillar was actually called Brilliance without pretense. And he took exception to the word brilliant. And as hardcore scientists do,
Yep.
they read into it a little bit differently. And he said, there's not very many brilliant people in the world, and I don't want to imply that we're all brilliant. And I was kind of taken aback at first. But as he kind of explained it, I thought he explained it really well, and we changed the word because of it. He suggested excellence, because excellence is something you work toward.
Hmm.
Brilliance is something you're born with.
I love
And he
that.
said that he truly believes anybody at the University of Arizona, any Wildcat, has the capacity to be excellent. And we have the tools to support them in that effort to be excellent.
I love that.
So yeah, it was a really great conversation. It was probably the most tense conversation
Sure.
of the process, but even that resulted in the work being better. And it's really important to acknowledge that those conversations do truly make the work better.
Yeah, I think that's something we've experienced. And I love that story because of the sort of action it requires, right? Brilliance is something you're born with, excellence is something you can pursue. I think that's so cool. And one of the things that you had mentioned was how that also opened the door for, like you said, accessibility. Anyone can participate in that, and anyone can participate in any one of those brand pillars at any given moment as we're moving through. And it gives you that sort of creative platform and foundation to then, how does this look in this campaign, or how does
Yeah.
this look for the Centennial Bear Down, and how does it sound, how does it feel, what do we want our community to respond with. um, I'd love to ask you some questions sort of more generally about brand strategy, about how that gets applied. What do you think universities either get wrong or misunderstand around brand strategy?
Sorry. Um, I think a big thing that they misunderstand is something we talked about earlier, where they conflate brand strategy with pretty pictures on the page,
Mm,
right? With creative execution. Um, so I had mentioned we kind of give that brand 101 to anyone who was involved in the brand strategy work. That includes our marketing and communications professionals,
smart.
because I'll be perfectly honest, like my boss, Christy Harper, and I have not always agreed on how we define certain parts of brand strategy.
Sure.
And that's not the point, right? The point isn't that everyone has to approach this work exactly the same, but you do have to have a shared language and a shared understanding of what you mean when you say brand strategy. Um, and what we meant when we said brand strategy was not colors, not visual
Mm,
identity, not logos, not pretty pictures on the page. We meant the foundational pillars of who we are as an institution. And once we agreed on that, it made the work a lot easier to define, a lot easier to execute on.
I think that's one of the things, and I'm glad you touched on it, because that's part of the reason we sort of started these conversations with folks like yourself. Is if there was one playbook, we'd all be following it. If there was a right way to do all of this stuff that was unanimous across the industry, we wouldn't be able to have these conversations. You wouldn't have the separation between a great brand, a good brand, and a brand that needs work. And so I think having that intention and really understanding that, and then getting everybody in that conversation to understand what we're talking about here, just sort of level setting, is super, super valuable. And so anyone who is participating, higher education or not, in branding, there sort of needs to be a shared understanding of what our organization or our team or our audience believes it is, so that we can all move forward with intention that is aimed at something to create impact.
Absolutely.
What advice might you give, or what perspectives do you think might be valuable for someone in a similar position? Maybe they don't have the title of brand strategy, but they're working on brand strategy. What might you say to someone who's sort of thinking about it or in the middle of it, that could be valuable from the success that you guys have had?
Get your title to be brand strategy.
Smart.
I think, I mean,
Yeah.
it works best if someone owns it. And that doesn't mean that
Mm,
I'm the owner of the University of Arizona's brand. We're none of us as marketing and communications professionals own the brand.
right.
Uh, the audiences own the brand, but someone needs to be the owner of the process.
Mm,
And if it's a collective, if it's, I have a great team that I work with. My peers in my team are just some of the best people I've ever worked with. But before we had a, before I had my title, we just kind of all like picked our way
yeah.
through brand strategy, right? We had a strategy that we had inherited and we did our best to align with it, but nobody was really that voice in the room that said, that's not on strategy or that's missing this element.
Mm,
And with my title being brand strategy, everyone, again, going back to that very first thing I said, everyone knows when I come into the room that I'm approaching it from a brand strategy direction. And that doesn't mean that I always get my way, but it means that people recognize what my role in the room is.
yeah.
And I think that if you're a director of marketing just generally, and even if you're the most strategic minded person in the room, you're still the marketing person
Yeah.
and you're still going to be pushed to be thinking about that visual representation of the brand or the pretty pictures on the screen. But when you have that title, I think it lends to the credibility of the strategy and the importance of strategy first.
Yeah. I love that. Strategy first, even when it comes to branding, when it
Yeah.
comes to creative execution, when it comes to big ideas, I think is the difference, right? Anyone can kind of, well, not anyone, but most marketers would be able to jump right to execution. And we have that conversation with our clients all the time, who that's what the president sees. That's who their boss sees. That's who Jimmy down the road, who tells me every time he sees one of our ads, sees. And so
Yeah.
working on those foundational pieces maybe aren't as sexy to the outside world, but I think that's what allows it to sing or hit or be a great campaign. And so we have that conversation all the time.
And I won't pretend that like that's easy,
No, of
right?
course not.
Because you're right. I mean, we've all had leadership that's like, get me more applications next month or you're not doing your job. And you can't take a step back and talk strategy very easily when that's the expectation coming from your
Yeah.
leadership. Um, so I won't pretend that it was easy to get to where we are right now. We were kind of lucky in the circumstances that we had where with a presidential transition and with some leadership transition within the Marcom division, we were afforded a little bit more flexibility in what we were trying to accomplish. And we had some time to kind of prove the concept. And I think we've done a really good job of it to the point where now I couldn't imagine us doing it any other way.
I love that. I think one of the things we've had conversations with clients in here internally about is in a brand effort, you sort of have to play defense long enough to get it off the ground so that it can play offense for you. And you
Yeah.
don't have to do it as much, and you don't have to defend it with such vigor as you do at the beginning to get something sort of new or, not different, but just more intentional, strategic. It might move a little bit slower than we're used to, but it's going to set us up for success further down the road. I think that's of paramount importance when you're talking about full scale brand operations at this scale. Well, I'd love to shift into a conversation about how that gets applied and the things you've done based on that brand strategy so that it doesn't just live in somebody's brand folder or on the website or something. You're actually using that to do creative executions or to launch campaigns that have a strategic intention. You guys mentioned the Bear Down 100. I think that's going to be awesome. Congratulations on launching that. If there's a time frame that we need to launch this episode in to not conflict with anything, you let us know. But one of the really cool things that was going on sort of shortly after the conference and when we were kind of having our preliminary talks about this podcast episode was the Galaxy Slam. Teaming up with both athletics, your amazing space sciences programs, researchers, professors, to pull something integrated to that level with the size of institution that Arizona is, I just thought was chef's kiss on applied brand strategy. Can you give a little bit of context to Galaxy Slam? And then I'll have some questions for you.
Yeah, for sure. So Galaxy Slam had a really long lead time, as many uh, big campus efforts do.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually started before we finished the brand strategy. It kind of started around when we were starting to talk about the brand strategy work, with a really informal conversation between myself, my colleague Alex Holcomb, who runs our brand development team with trademarks and
Nice.
licensing and sponsorships, and somebody some of you might have heard of, our basketball head coach, Tommy Lloyd. The three of us sat down in his office, which was a trip even for me. Um, and we pitched him on this idea of bringing space sciences to one of his basketball games. And he loved it. And to be
That's awesome.
honest, like him saying he loved it was probably the thing that made it happen,
Sure.
right? Having somebody at that profile buy into something that you want to do,
So cool.
one gives us kind of the push to say, well, now you have to do it. You have
Yeah.
no choice. But also lends some credibility campus wide, saying, being able to say to our astronomy department, hey, the basketball team and Coach Lloyd are excited about this. They get a little bit more excited to help us make it happen,
Oh yeah.
right? So that happened. Then we had to deal with a lot of the, fun stuff like convincing Nike they should make custom jerseys and some custom merch for us, and all of that stuff that
Sure.
uh, took some effort on the back end. But then as we started getting into the strategic vision of it really did just perfectly dovetail with the brand strategy, right? In particular, that idea of excellence without pretense. We literally shot, you've seen a basketball hype video, right?
Mm,
We shot one of those with six of our most esteemed space science researchers.
so cool.
We have Carlos Vargas, who is the PI for the NASA Aspera mission. He's launching a small satellite into space in the next like several months, and we had him dunking a basketball on the McHale Center floor. We had Marsha Ricci, who has she built the camera for the NIRCam for the James Webb Space Telescope. So if you've seen any of the beautiful images from the James Webb Space Telescope, that's thanks to her camera. And we had her out there dribbling a basketball in fog machine. Like,
It's awesome.
and fun fact, Marsha Ricci played basketball when she was a student at MIT.
No
So
way. That's
she had a
awesome.
basketball background, which made it all the more fun. Um, so we really embodied that excellence without pretense. But to use my recipe analogy, all of those other brand pillars are in there too.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of our legacy, our enduring legacy, we've been number one in research expenditures in astronomy 37 of the last 38 years. And so that tradition is true to who we are. And it wouldn't be possible without us being here in the Sonoran Desert. And that bear down spirit is, it's rooted in athletics, but
Mm-hmm.
extends well beyond. And it's very clear in that creative uh, that's where this is rooted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was a really fun project to work on. We kind of we treat a lot of things kind of coalition of the willing. That's an
Nice.
advantage we have as a big university, right?
Yeah.
We don't need every single person to 100% buy in for something to be large scale and successful.
Hmm.
But we did have, we had a big kickoff where we invited pretty much anyone who wanted to come learn about what we were trying to accomplish. So we had the astronomy department, we had our enrollment team, we had our foundation, we had kind of everybody you could think of in one Zoom meeting. Actually, about half of us were actually in person, and we just talked about all the things that were possible.
Yeah.
One bit of advice for anybody thinking about doing something like this: don't try to do everything that's possible. We had probably 50 really good ideas, and one of the first things we did was narrow that down into 6 things that we really thought we could accomplish. And so the things that we accomplished were we had custom jerseys for the basketball team to wear.
Yeah, they're sweet.
We had 6 scientists that we got this hype video for. We created some awesome trading cards. I've got my autographed set of Arizona Space Sciences rookie cards ready to frame up on my wall. Um, we actually created a new illustration of our mascot of Wilbur wearing the space jersey and dunking the basketball. We hosted departments across campus hosted about 5 distinct events throughout the course of the week. So we are our planetarium, which is the number 4 planetarium in the country, according to a recent USA Today survey. Uh, they hosted events throughout the week. Our astronomy department hosted a really great lecture. Our College of Science hosted a great event. We had trivia night for the students, which was really well attended. And then we kind of culminated in the basketball game. And actually, post game the next day, one of our scientists was a guest on the coach's radio show. So it was really a unique opportunity to bring space sciences to the number 2 basketball team in the country.
Yeah.
And it it did what it was intended to do, right? There were lots of people who had never seen what we're doing in the space sciences, and they learned about our excellence in it in a way that felt super accessible, right? It
Hmm.
wasn't like we got Marsha Riki to stand at half court and say, when I was building this camera, I had to
Right.
measure this angle and calculate this. And no, we just had her out there holding a basketball and said she's the Big 12 Faculty of the Year for the university. And she's been here for 50 years. And she creates those pretty pictures that you see coming from the James Webb Space Telescope. And that creates such a level of pride
Mm.
on both sides. Honestly, the unintended or the maybe less expected outcome of this was the amount of goodwill that we created with faculty.
Oh.
I've had so many deans, department heads, faculty members, both in College of Science and outside of the College of Science, who have said it was so profound to them to see science, research, academics represented in an athletics platform.
Yeah.
And it created, pride across the campus.
I love that. I think, the national stage that the basketball team is consistently on. We talk about recruitment and enrollment and the institutional KPIs, but stuff like that is measured in the sort of anecdotal human element and response of highlighting faculty at that level, and just the amount of, like you had mentioned, pride that comes with that just brings you closer to the brand, to your audience, to your community, to your campus. And I think that was such a cool example of you guys being really, really intentional with how we apply brand strategy. Because I think it's easy, especially for me, to just sort of talk about it theoretically. It sort of lives there, and we have all of these brand pillars, and I have a ton of language that supports the ideas that I'm telling you. But until I see it, or until it's tangible and has an impact on our audiences, it's hard to sort of quantify that. I think my favorite part that you had shared with me about the Galaxy Slam story is that this wasn't just a sunk 3-pointer. Like, you guys continually had ideas. There was unsuccessful situations. There was things where we collaborated, but outcomes weren't, what we wanted or what we expected. But, when given enough opportunity and chances with how we integrate, you can pull something really, really awesome off.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's important. Sorry, I
No,
think
go.
it's important to note that this was not like the first attempt at this. We tried to do something a couple of years ago that did end up being just like, oh yeah, you had 7 or 8 faculty out at midfield during a football game, but nobody really knew why,
Yeah.
and it didn't really accomplish what it set out to accomplish. And then we taken faculty on donor trips with basketball, and tried to get some kind of cross-pollination of those things,
Mm.
and all of those things, well, not as successful as we wanted them to be, were what built up to being able to do the Galaxy Slam activation that was super
Yes.
successful. Not only that, but the success of Galaxy Slam will build on the success of Galaxy Slam 2027, because we've already had even more people. I mean, one of my favorite stories out of Galaxy Slam was actually that we have a space on our campus called Worlds of Words, and it's actually a really cool thing. It's one of the, if not the largest, it's one of the largest collections of global children's books in the
Oh,
world.
wow.
Um, and the woman who runs the Worlds of Words just was at a meeting where I presented what we were doing for Galaxy Slam, and was personally inspired by it, because her son actually has worked is has his degree in space sciences, and had worked with one of our most prominent researchers on campus, and she herself was a student athlete, so it kind of triangulated
Mm.
all of her own personal interests. And so she created this phenomenal exhibit at Worlds of Words that was totally unprompted by us. We didn't reach out to her and ask her to do this. She was just personally inspired by this, and created one of my favorite things that happened during Galaxy Slam. And so those
That's amazing.
things just compound each other as we move into the future. And I have no doubt, we had our raise the bar meeting on Galaxy Slam yesterday, our kind of after action
Yeah.
meeting. Um, and after that meeting, I have no doubt that Galaxy Slam 2027 will be even more fun and more impactful than it was this year.
That's amazing. I would love to do just a quick little lightning round.
Okay, let's do
Throw you
it.
some softballs, hopefully. Don't feel like you have to answer any of these too seriously, but I'll throw them across. We'll answer, and then we can wrap up and we can get you out of here, Frank. This was great. Thank you
Cool.
so much again.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me,
Of
Justin. It's been fun.
course. Okay, some lightning round questions for you. Um, we'll start with an easy one, hopefully. What is one university brand that you admire besides the University of
Ah,
Arizona? I
man,
know that's an
I
easy
don't
one.
know that that's an easy one, Justin. I think there's a lot of brands that I admire for different reasons. I mean, I think what Ethan Braden's doing at Texas A&M is really
Yeah,
cool. Like, he's got some really creative, out of the box things that he's been doing. It's yeah,
it's the cowboy hat.
obviously, yeah, it's the cowboy hat, it's all
Yeah,
of that, but
that's
but
awesome.
I think he's been the stuff he's doing with Fast Company, and the stuff that they've done with like NASCAR and stuff, it's super out of the box, and I think really fun to keep a pulse on.
Yeah.
I also think, maybe a little bit more on the traditional side of things. I think Boise State's campaign has
Mm,
always stood out to me as fun,
strong.
especially in that context of like connecting athletics to academics. The leaning into that blue field
And they did that
was a
university
really cool
wide.
concept. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think those are probably two that stand out to me.
Yeah, those are really good.
I'll give
Um,
some props to my friends up north at ASU. They're probably the most consistent from a messaging standpoint of
yeah,
any university in the country.
love like giving shout outs to the school across the river. Um, what about not in higher ed? What about just a brand in the market that you think is doing really well from a brand strategy perspective?
I mean, I think the I actually know who's doing some cool stuff right now is Pepsi. Pepsi has been, everybody saw the Super Bowl commercial, right? And the polar bears, and kind of really taking on that direct competitor.
Yeah.
But they also did something cool recently. I don't know if you listen to the Stuff You Should Know podcast. It's one of my favorites.
Not
But it's
consistently, but yes.
yeah, they had an episode recently that was about like cognitive bias,
Oh,
and
sure.
Pepsi actually did a three-part commercial throughout that episode that was about the cognitive bias of the Pepsi challenge, where like
Mm,
people prefer the taste of Pepsi, but because Coke has done such a good job on branding, they choose Coke.
yeah,
And I thought that was a really cool kind of lean into your brand kind of moment in that kind of unique space.
that's awesome. Um, one piece of advice you might have for brand leaders in higher ed, and you kind of touched on it before, but if you had to do it for a lightning round.
Take the time to do it right. I know it's hard. I know it takes kind of arguing with your boss sometimes, maybe, but take the time to do it right.
Yeah, take the time to save the time, really. Um, in your mind, the future of university branding is
Distinctive,
mm,
strategic. We got to get away from table stakes. We got to get away from
love it.
drone shots, and it's
Sans serif
crazy that
fonts,
three in
yeah.
a tree is still like the thing, right? It's we got to get away from some of that stuff.
I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Frank. I appreciate you being here. Um, I'm sure we'll catch each other at the next AMA. And if you're ever interested, we would love to have you back. If you're ever in Spearfish, I know it's a bit of a drive, but we would love to have you in studio, show you around the giant metropolis of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But thank you again so much. We appreciate your time and your perspectives. I think your position, your role, the things you guys have done at the university, so many folks can learn from, and so I appreciate you being on and sharing that with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. It was fun. I
Awesome.
appreciate it.